Welcome back to the 279th episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories talking about Washington dysfunction, including one coming from the New York Times talking about the Senate and how it actually can't get anything done, talking about SCOTUS and how the conception of SCOTUS being partisan and non-functional is actually not helping anything, along with the fact that the Congress won't govern, and then how basic income has been implemented in Denver, and that's a pretty interesting one. So we'll get to that at the end. It's going to be its own standalone thing. And of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. Now, that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump into our game segment, Dip, Dive, and Dodge. Roll the intro here.
Let's get ready to dip, dive, and dodge.
All right, so I think I've left enough time in post for me to actually add that in. So how this game actually works. Politicians very often get asked questions about very specific policy proposals, and they also have the one that they want to talk about that's a little bit different. They don't want to be confined or put into a box, so they kind of dip, dive, dodge. They're looking at the punches, they're like, ooh, 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 trying to avoid them. So they kind of pivot to their policy proposal. And very often they shamelessly plug something that they're doing. So we have all of those elements. I have a policy proposal that I've looked at, which has helped me formulate a question to the politician as a journalist, and then I will respond as the politician to a policy proposal I haven't looked at yet, and then also include a little bit of self-promotion. So you're going to see me, dip, diving, and dodging in order to get there. So I'll take on the persona of the reporter. City Council Member Smith, in our great city of Mawakata, we have been dealing with a crisis of plastics and various different litter and so on and so forth. And there has been a push to increase our recycling and to even implement a zero waste city initiative where everything will go into certain areas where it will be recycled. We will reuse every single thing that comes in and out of our city. And we want to see this implemented, or multiple people do want to see this implemented in the city council. What do you say about this policy proposal, and how would you implement this zero waste city initiative? Well, thank you so much, my friend from the Dispatch. I understand that waste and the ability to recycle is something that not everybody, waste is something that affects everybody, but the ability to recycle is not something that everybody has the means to do. And this sort of stratification of our city, of the different levels of income, is something that we need to deal with and address within Mawakata. And that is why I want to have inclusive housing development programs where we actually have people from all different stratas of the society, all different levels, whether they be people who haven't been able to afford a home before or somebody who is making $100,000, so that we can actually bring these different segments of the population together and get them to experience one another's worldview and make sure that we bridge these sort of gaps so that everybody can be united for fronts for the ones that such as the one that you proposed. And I actually talk about this in my podcast, Progressive Pulse, Innovation in Urban Policy, where we've been trying for years upon years to address some of these stratifications and also bring together a concise urban planning policy so that at the end of the day, we can address all of these problems for Mawakata and get these people to feel as though they are properly represented and get them into the housing that they deserve. Thank you so much for your question. So you can see where all of that comes from. I'll be honest, the zero waste thing threw me for a second, because that is a pretty big proposal in order to get a completely zero waste city. But, hey, we were able to kind of make it work, even though it was a little awkward there in the middle. But now that we've gotten our fun out of the way, let's jump to our first article from the New York Times. Headline reads, "It's unanimous. In the Senate, neither party consents to the other's ideas." So, for those of you who were not tuned into some of the SCOTUS decisions, there was the bump stock decision coming out on last Friday, I believe. And from there, they actually put a proposal forward in the Senate. And now we're starting to see that there is a little bit of contention here. The idea that this bump stock came in during Trump's time led some people to believe that the Senate Republicans would be totally okay with it. And then there was a little bit of pushback. And what they tried to do was a unanimous consent. What they're abbreviating here is a UC, in order to just get this passed without any problems whatsoever. And then what happens if it's not completely unanimous, meaning that every single senator is on board, then it doesn't get passed. This is actually how they approve different appointees, even in the military. This is how Tommy Tuberville was able to actually keep some of the appointees from getting through the Senate when it came to military appointments, because normally they go through the UC process and they don't actually take a separate vote on it. They do it so, okay, everybody agrees that we need to get these approvals through. We need to get these people into their positions. Let's just go with that. So we've seen the same mechanism used in the past. We've also seen the pushback and resistance mechanism used, where people say, no, we're not going to get behind this. And then guess what? Lindsey Graham said, no, I am not going to allow this to go through with a UC. And there's not enough votes on the Republican side overall in order to get a normal bill or piece of legislation passed. And this is actually highlighting some of the underlying dysfunction, because rather than actually litigating or legislating this and giving play on both sides and saying, okay, hold on, we want this, but maybe we're going to have to give up this, that, or the other, they just want to get the thing passed exactly as it is, no contention, no actual. And okay, so you may be thinking, well, hey, they have a point. This was put through by the ATF underneath Donald Trump, so Republicans should be okay with it. One, the conversation could have shifted since then. We could have been a rash decision, and I'm not saying it was, but imagine that the environmental agency, the EPA, comes out and they make a rule and everybody loves it at the time. Then it goes through the scrutiny of the Supreme Court. They say, no, as a executive agency, you don't actually have the ability to do this. If you want this to happen, then it's going to have to be something that you have to do through Congress, aka you have to legislate. That is the whole idea of our separations of power. So let's examine that idea, or at least let's take on the idea that we could actually legislate on it, or that the Senate and the House could actually do something about it, and it wouldn't just be a unanimous consent sort of deal. How would that work? You would have to give a little bit on one side. You would have to say, okay, you want this, but you don't necessarily want that. And guess what? The point of the article is not actually saying that either side is willing to do that. What the argument they're saying is, no, either side doesn't actually consent to the ideas of the other side, which is what they say. Neither party consents to the other's ideas. Now, it's really hard to just consent full force to somebody else's idea, and when you have to do it with the unanimous consent, because you're not allowed to change anything, you just pass it as is. So maybe the argument should be neither side actually wants to work on this, and the argument placed in this article is that both sides want to use it as a political talking point. They want to use it in the election. They actually give another example here, and I want to read that one as well because I thought it was a very interesting conversation that talks about the in vitro battle that has been going on between the Democrats and the Republicans. So, quote, Senate Democrats want a protection for IVF, Mr. Cruz asserted after his legislation was blocked. They want a campaign issue. He said Senate Democrats don't want a protection for IVF. And this is in follow-up to, quote, Democrats considered their in vitro protection bill consequential enough to hold a doomed test vote last week and force every Republican to record their position. All but two opposed it. Trying to soften the blow, Senator Ted Cruz, Republican of Texas, made a unanimous consent request for the Senate to instead pass a Republican version of the in vitro fertilization protection measure that Democrats considered woefully inadequate, and an objection was heard. So, here is what they're laying out. if you actually want to get certain legislation passed, you're going to put it to a proper vote. You want to get people on the record. We've talked about this previously, how you want to have single issue bills. And I understand when I talk about negotiating and trying to get what other people want inside these bills in order to bring them to the table, it's hard to have a single issue bill at that point, because if you need to get somebody from Kentucky, or you need to get somebody from Massachusetts or from North Dakota, you may have to sprinkle in a little bit of funding for a local military base that has lots of jobs that they can go and tout to their people. So it can't just be completely single issue, but these are smaller adjacent things that get thrown into these bills. And when you are just trying to get people on the record and not actually have a bipartisan bill, you do exactly what the Democrats did here, which is say, okay, hey, we care about in vitro fertilization. You say you care about it. Let's get you on the record voting against it. And then what is interesting, which the author is highlighting here, is the UC is no longer just a tool to get things passed. It's actually a tool to say, no, we care about this, but guess what? Even these other people, they didn't actually do it. So you're probably saying, Alex, why are you doing this rant? Because all of these things, even Ted Cruz doing the UC, the Democrats trying to get everybody on the vote, because everybody to actually come out and say what their position is and vote against the bill, so on and so forth. All of these things are no longer tools to govern. They are just tools for the media battle. So when Ted Cruz says, hey, they just won a election issue, they ain't wrong. Okay, he ain't wrong. But guess what? That's what the Republicans are doing too. That's why he passed the UC, because he literally wanted to signal saying, hey, actually, we also care about in vitro fertilization. We just don't want to go as far as them. So we're going to pass, or we're going to try to get a unanimous consent vote. And the Democrats, see, what's interesting, though, is even if the in vitro bill didn't go far enough, or the proposal from Ted Cruz didn't go far enough, why would you not at least take up the UC that he is putting forward? And the answer is either they are so politically and philosophically pinned to the idea that this in vitro fertilization bill has to go forward in the capacity that we put it out there, otherwise it is totally inadequate. Then they go with that option, which I'm hesitant to believe that it is truly a principled stand versus, no, we're not going to give a Republican a win on this. We're not going to allow them to have this issue. We don't necessarily want this to come back and bite us in the butt during election season. And guess what? Like I said, it is both political posturing. So what could we do? So this is one thing I was thinking while we were going through here. If you want to get the bump stock ban or restriction put through and properly legislated through the House and the Senate, and we're going to pretend this is a world where we are not so divided that neither side can give the other side wins, because that's one of the main restrictions now, especially going into an election year. The political realities are we don't want to give the other side a win. We don't want them to be able to tout this. Even if both sides would be able to come together and say that this is a win, there are just partisan actors on the left and the right that would not even want to give the other side anything, any morsel of credibility, saying, hey, we were actually able to get something done. If we're both going down, we're going down together seems to be the idea. But if they wanted to get something passed, what would they do? So you would say, okay, we're going to add bump stock restrictions. This is something that 2A advocates will not be happy about. There are 2A advocates on the left and the right in the House of Representatives as well as in the Senate. Doesn't matter if they come from a really red state with a small blue district or if they come from a very blue state with a few red districts. There's a mixed bag there, and the electorate has different needs, different wants, so on and so forth. So you could probably convince some people from different areas to come together, but not enough to actually get it passed. What do? Maybe you remove some restrictions on who can own a firearm, how long people can't own a firearm, how restrictive a background check may be. Maybe there's some other lever that you pull to ease up on who or when or where people can have firearms. And then you can say, okay, look, we're coming down on this thing that we know is bad, that the ATF even said we do not want bad people having. And then we also ease up on some of the overall restrictions, because guess what? Have we 100% proven that all of those restrictions are actually effective at stopping bad people from getting guns? No, there's plenty of research about that. But even if you don't want to go down that tact, even if you do not want to take that approach, there are plenty of other levers that seem idiotic to some 2A people who may mean it may mean nothing, absolutely nothing to the average lay voter, and you give them a morsel on that end while also restricting bump stocks. That can get both people in line, but no, okay? So, and I understand you don't want to abridge the Second Amendment whatsoever. The 2A people don't like any restrictions, but if you're going to actually, for the most part, because the New York Times does have some argument here, which is that a Republican president put this through. Then again, is he the most Republican president in the world? No, he's kind of more like a political convenientist, if that's a word, okay? I think a truly principled 2A president would not have let the ATF go through with this. Even though the ATF shouldn't have been doing it in the first place, it should have been something that's legislated. But if you wanted to have a happy medium, and you actually were living in a false world where something could actually happen, that is how you would go about it. But no, there can be no compromise. There can be no middle ground, especially going into an election year. And if you think that's good, you think that's bad, I don't really care. I'm not trying to say whether our political system is amazing or it's terrible. I'm trying to point out the flaws and say, hey, maybe we should consider fixing some of these things. Now, the other huge problem that this highlights, and yes, it's sort of a knock-on effect, but it's also just a overall systematic issue, is the Supreme Court is doing its utmost to keep the separation of powers, or at least keep the powers separated, the executive. And this is a case that has been laid out by Sarah Isker at the Dispatch and lots of political actors on both the left and the right for quite some time. And this is one of the things that you talk about in high school, you talk about as a layperson sometimes, but the political classes, they don't necessarily bring it up as often anymore. It's normally the commentariat or people who have worked in government and are now removed from it, which is the executive is supposed to execute, the legislator is supposed to legislate. It's almost as if it's in their name. But the legislator is supposed to make bills and change the law, and then the executive executes those laws. So the ATF's ruling, or their ban on bump stocks, was more of a legislative move. It was something that it was a rule that was just crafted whole cloth, and this is something that I've talked about extensively. We do this all the time now, where we have regulatory agencies basically making laws, and then, even though some people may like those regulations and those rules, it goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, you do not have the power to do this. You are not a legislator. You cannot come in and just, oh, yep, we're going to sign this into law, basically. Oh, this thing is banned. And then the Supreme Court gets a whole bunch of flack for it because the executive agency wants to have more power than it's supposed to, and the legislative agency, they just want to win elections. They don't want to necessarily, especially in our world where you can't give the other side the win, that's what we highlighted, they don't actually do their job. And I was saying that this has been something that both commentariats have said for a long time. The first time that I heard it from somebody who was a Washington insider, someone who worked in Washington and gave a very strong legal case for it, not just a principled case, which is, no, the executive has too much power. That's a conservative talking point you've heard for quite some time. Oh, yeah, we've been consolidating power in the executive. We're getting closer to a little bit of fear-mongering, a little bit of truth sprinkled in there, which is the executive has gotten too big. But it actually lays it out very well from Sarah Isker on a podcast that I listen to. I've done a little bit of reading of her stuff at the Dispatch as well, and she has a very great perspective on this, and so do other people that she talks to, that at the end of the day, if the legislator is going to give up its ability to legislate, and it's going to say, hey, we don't want to be culpable for this, we just want to keep our positions, we want to stay in Congress, we want to stay in the Senate, then, and the people want something to get done, the legislator is sitting there, oh, nope, not our job, and the executive is going to say, well, hey, I have the popular mandate, I'm going to try to use XYZ power, going to read it into the law, and then make said proposal, make said policy, whether it be student loan forgiveness, whether it be the ATF decision, whether it be environmental regulations, so on and so forth. The Supreme Court has to step in and say, hey, no, we're not doing this. It's not something that you can actually do within the executive branch, and then people get mad at the Supreme Court. And don't get me wrong, the Supreme Court itself has also tried to legislate from the bench for a long time. It's not just the conservative court; it was also liberal courts in the past. I'm not trying to pretend like, the Supreme Court is the best. It's the only institution that matters. But right now, they're getting a brunt of the hate for overturning some of these decisions, when the blame for a lot of them should be put on the executive and the legislative for not doing their jobs correctly. Then again, I understand that there are other cases where people from the conservative side of the aisle who are the ones that are saying, no, the Supreme Court is great, because guess what? There is a majority of people who are constitutionalists and people who come from the Federalist Society. They are saying, oh no, these other rulings, I don't know about all that. It's a question of, well, okay, is anybody happy with the Supreme Court? Sometimes, some other times, not so much. So guess what? Maybe we should reevaluate how we think about the Supreme Court. And one of the great ways to do that is to stop expecting them to legislate from the bench and stop expecting them to come down on your side of the aisle. Oh, wait, no, we can't. We can't reframe it that way, because everybody wants their own thing to go through, make it any of their proposals. They want their perspective to win out. And when the legislator can't actually make effectual changes and take on risks themselves because they don't want to lose their jobs, they don't want liability, they don't want to even have the credit for it, because guess what? Sometimes that credit can become blowback. The Supreme Court is where everything goes to an end. And sometimes the Supreme Court says we're handing it back. There's no precedent here. We're handing it back. Sometimes they say there's no standing with the mifepristone thing. They're saying there is no reason for you to bring this case. But at the end of the day, it ends up making one group or another mad. So this brings up an interesting article from the Dispatch with the headline reading, "The Polarized SCOTUS That Wasn't." And, I did just talk about Sarah Isker in the Dispatch a minute ago, and we're returning to them now because I think this is another very interesting perspective. I've ranted enough about it. Let's just jump into the first two paragraphs. Quote, "Conventional wisdom suggests that the Supreme Court, like the country, is deeply divided along partisan and ideological lines. But this overlooks the court's historic recent run of unanimous decisions, and the fact that the liberal and conservative justices often don't vote as blocs. Court critics tend to respond to these inconvenient realities by saying things like, sure, but on the big cases, the culturally divisive ones, the conservatives form a majority and the liberals the dissenting minority." And actually, I realize now there's actually a little bit more that we should probably read into this first paragraph, because it's important to have this a little bit of context. Quote, "This is obviously true sometimes. The Dobbs decision, which overruled Roe v. Wade, is a paradigmic example. While I think Dobbs was correctly decided on the merits, it was also an important polarizing ruling along ideological lines. I'm happy," and this is him going on, I'm going to try to make it quick, quote, "I'm happy to concede that, but why can't critics concede the reverse? When the court doesn't rule along ideological lines on an important case, they simply stop calling the cases important. As the Dispatch's own Sarah Isker," that's also why I brought her up, because she was mentioned in this article, "and economist Dean Jens recently put it in Political, if one defines important as the most politically divisive, then it becomes circular. Which cases are divisive? The important ones. Which cases are important? The divisive ones." You see, and that's why I wanted to keep going, because there is something to that definition there. It is, obviously, this is an important case because it is breaking down along cultural lines, which means it's speaking to the paradigm, the divide of the United States and the people within it in the two different political blocs. And then that means that the important ones are divisive, and that also means that if they're divisive, they're important. You can see where they are coming from with this argument, and I think there is most definitely something to talk about. I have on this podcast multiple times when Okay, so I'm not trying to blow my own horn. I'm not trying to say that nobody covered it. But when Ketanji Brown Jackson went with the conservatives, when Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett have ruled with the conservatives before, with the more liberal justices before, when even Sotomayor has come down on the side with Roberts, which doesn't necessarily mean that much because I'll be honest, it's not like maybe Sotomayor does fall into one group rather than the other, and so does John Roberts, but I would say they're closer than the furthest extremes of anybody on the court, personally. But that's just my opinion on the matter. We have covered here the multiple times that the decisions haven't gone in a 6-3, they've gone maybe an 8-2, maybe they've gone a 7-2 or an 8-1. We've covered multiple instances, especially when Ketanji Brown Jackson was first on the court, because everybody on the conservative side was saying, oh, she can't even tell you what a woman is. That was what was happening in her confirmation. And sure, she didn't want to define what a woman was. Whether or not you care about that cultural issue, it's fair enough to point out that one of the Supreme Court justices wasn't going to actually pigeonhole herself into something that would not be friendly to people on her side of the aisle. Fair enough. But there was so much criticism for that, and yet within the first month and a half that she was on there, she ruled with the more constitutionalists multiple times. I feel very unfortunate that I can't remember the exact cases that we were discussing at that point when she was first put onto the court. But my point being that while they're not calling just balls and strikes, fair enough. I think that even though I would love to believe that they have undergirding philosophies that go beyond just their conservative ideology, which could still lend itself to coming down on one side of the aisle more often than not, that doesn't mean that it's so restrictive that they are only focused on, oh, what would my political side want? If that was the case, then mifepristone would be banned. Even when these people didn't have proper standing, it would be banned. And guess what? Amy Coney Barrett, she was rinsing them throughout the course of the anti-mifepristone side. She was rinsing them, asking, wait, hold on, I thought that this wouldn't actually restrict this, that, or the other. She was obviously very hesitant to take on their point, even though she would probably agree that we don't want to have anything that enables any sort of chemical killing of a child, at least from the conservatives' point of view. So it makes me extremely frustrated when, one, the Supreme Court gets things laid at its feet because the system doesn't work as it's supposed to. And when I was in college, I listened to my professor say that they're not actually doing anything. They're just sitting on their laurels in the House and the Senate, and they're not actually getting anything done. And that's why the executive has to take up so much power. And I sat there and I said, okay, so you may be right that something's not happening, but the whole point of our legislative system is supposed to be slow and contemplative. It's supposed to be difficult. And I was standing on that perspective alone. And now I understand, even if I don't necessarily agree with the remedy that is being proposed by some people, I understand the argument more that this is an actual problem. And it's not just a problem because things aren't getting passed and people have issues. If that was just it, then I would say that's the whole point. It's supposed to be slow. But when they are abdicating their duty, not just doing their duty slowly and not coming to anything or not being able to find a solution that's in the middle and having to work it out or wait until they have majorities, which even then I think is not necessarily the best way to go about it. But we've had liberal and conservative majorities for long times that have gotten things passed and had resistance from the other side and gotten some sort of abdication from them. So even that system can work because guess what? If you have a majority, but you can't get everybody in your party, you do have to go. This is like Mike Johnson going to the Democrats in order to make sure that he didn't get ousted when it came to a vote. If you can do the same thing when it comes to political issues and you say, hey, we need this block of Republicans who may be okay, or this block of Democrats that may be okay with our proposal, but we're going to have to concede a little bit of something, that is still conceding some part of your agenda, trying to work in a bipartisan manner, and it's still slow, but it gets things done. Versus the system where nobody is willing to even concede because at the end of the day, everything is recorded. It's a social media world. Everything gets broadcasted and anybody gets lambasted for betraying their side, so to speak. it leads to issues beyond the legislator, because then these issues that people care about and people are clamoring about that they're not actually able to get done through the legislator get pushed off to the executive, such as student loan relief. Or then, therefore, because the executive's trying to take on more power, they're trying to get something done that they don't know whether they have precedent to actually do or the authority to do, then the Supreme Court gets called in and they have to overstep their bounds a little bit. And I say overstep their bounds, they're doing their job, but it's perceived as overstepping their bounds because guess what? Somebody else isn't stepping up to the plate, aka the legislator. And not just the legislator as a system, but certain people within the legislator. I understand that winning I don't want to say the virtue battles, winning the, hey, we want XYZ policy battle, I understand that on principled stands, sometimes you cannot move. I'm not going to pretend that that is not the case. But also, you are in the legislature to be a practical agent, not just a purist. You're not just there to be a purist. Some people, that is literally their only political philosophy. Some libertarians, that is the only political philosophy they have, to be a purist on certain things. Fair enough. And you know what? If your people put you in there to be a purist, I guess I'm wrong. But a lot of people don't put their representatives in there to be purists. That's why you don't see a lot of hardcore libertarians inside of Congress. No, they put them there to get things done, which means you have to be more of a practical agent. Okay, that's a long enough rant on those two. I want to spend maybe a minute and a half on our last article that comes from Business Insider. Headline reads, Denver gave people experiencing homelessness $1,000 a month. A year later, nearly half of the participants had housing. Now, that is a completely true headline. I'll read some of the parameters of this study. So there were participants who were sorted into random groups. One received $1,000 a month for a year. Another got $6,500 up front, followed by $500 a month. And a third got $50 a month as a control group. Now, all of these different groups had different outcomes ever so slightly. How many of the participants actually were able to go off of this program when they were done with it, or after they had gotten housing, were they able to go off the program and continue to have their housing? The number is not explicitly listed here, considering that 45 of the participants were able to secure their own house and apartments after receiving basic income for 10 months. It probably means that that percentage is somewhere around 20-25%. That is a total guess. I have not looked into the separate details of this research, so that's fair enough. If I am completely wrong, go and look at it. So that is an assumption on my part. But even then, we don't have to actually work with that assumption because only 45% were able to get housing. Here's the interesting part. The report estimates that this caused a reduction in public services used, saving the city $589,214. So if that savings could be directly redistributed into this program, and therefore that's how much you're able to actually give out to the participants of this program, which is not how it actually works, even though this pilot was funded by different foundations as well as the city. So if you could find outside private actors, like churches, that are willing to give to this program, you can make it work and provide savings for the taxpayer that could be kicked back into it. I think that's fair enough. It could work out. If you're creating a system that analyzes, fixes, and then you move on to another person, or you allow that person to get on the program, move on afterwards, and keep going, great. A lot of people, it's in the anecdotal evidence down here, a lot of people still actually said that they didn't know how they would fare without the program afterwards. So, with basic income, and let's be clear, I understand it's very contentious here, but with basic income, they're not actually proposing that this is we're going to fix homelessness for a short period of time, we're going to get you out of it, and then you're going to go on and be off the program. They're actually testing having this be a permanent thing. I think the better way to do it is to address it. If you want to have this work, be more of a program that lifts people up. You can only be on it for a certain amount of time, and then you can say or make the argument that this program is actually cutting down on the amount of resources that have to go to the homeless shelters, who have to go to emergency care for these sort of people who are not having the best life outside of a homed environment. They are homeless or unhoused, I believe is the proper term that we're supposed to use nowadays. But if you want to make an argument for a system like that, a welfare system that actually increases the amount of money in the coffers of the state or the city because it's reducing all these extra costs that are going into keeping this population safe, healthy, so on and so forth, then that's fair enough. If it's a temporary program and it's effective at getting people into homes and off of the state, I don't want to say the word I want to say, the state benefits, that is absolutely great. But what this study says is, hey, this program can work, but also it seems to indicate that there is a certain percentage of the people that will not be able to permanently get off of the program, which is very interesting. Also, here's the overall cost. So I talked about how it was actually saving the city around $590,000 a year in public services. Quote, the city of Denver and the Colorado Trust, an anonymous foundation, funded the project and has already provided more than $9.4 million to participants. So now they're not, let's be clear, they probably don't have a full estimation of all of the savings yet, but they have a rough estimation for a certain period of time, and that's what that 590,000 is. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one, okay? It's not like they said, okay, we're going to throw in $9.4 million in order to help these people out, and it's saving us that exact same amount of money. If we can find a way to make this actually work, where it's a temporary program that helps people for a short period of time, think of welfare programs under Bill Clinton. Hey, there's going to be an expiration date. We want you to help you get your stuff together, but we can't let you be on it forever. It's going to be a little bit means tested. Fair enough. And also, if it had a break-even point where it actually technically pays for itself, or at least it's redirecting funds that would be used somewhere else in order to, in my opinion, it would be better, instead of helping people facilitate their homelessness, to actually get them into homes and help them prosper and have families and all that. I think I would be okay with that. Even though I don't love welfare programs, like I said, if it was means tested and also it did something instead of aiding and abetting that sort of lifestyle, which is degrading for a certain amount of people, and enabling them to live more fulfilling lives, or at least to have a home, an apartment, I would be okay with that because it's a direct offsetting of costs. That is what's happening here. But the program itself is very interesting, and especially going into a world where we may actually have to have a basic, what's the word I'm looking for? A basic income, or a UBI, universal basic income. I think it's at least interesting that some of these challenges are being taken on, and I'm not sad that people are testing this already, because either they're seeing the writing on the wall or they're trying to genuinely address problems. And I don't live in that district. It's not my money going to it. And also they raise the money from the outside. So I think it's a worthwhile thing to experiment with. That doesn't mean I think it should be implemented, but I thought it was an interesting article nonetheless, and I wanted to bring it to you guys. So tell me what you think down there in the comment section. With all that, let's jump into our daily delight. This one comes from Boing Boing. It's been a while since I could say Boing Boing in order to get some of these articles. I do actually really enjoy doing the phrasing like that. But that's not why we're doing this article, just so I could say the name of the company that's putting it out there. This article talks about a dog, you may have seen the clip, who loves getting a haircut. And goodness gracious, he looks so formal. He looks so uptight. He's got his chin up. He's like, yes, please cut my hair. Now, the owner's not actually cutting the hair, but it's kind of like a little play barber session. And honestly, this dog is absolutely adorable. Stays very still, kind of closes his eyes. Like, yeah, okay, that kind of feels like a massage. I bet there are a million different things running through this dog's head. At least it had me thinking, what would I think if I was a dog in that situation? But either way, it's very adorable. And if you want to check it out, or you want to check out any of today's articles, all of them will be linked in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Google Podcasts, as well as Podvine, and the Twitter handle @YourDailyFlip, where I post a Twitter tirade every Tuesday and Thursday. The one that came out yesterday was about liberalism. I put the title as "The Empty Void That Is Liberalism," and I realize people may not actually like that title, but I think I pretty easily or quickly lay it out that liberalism can kind of inhabit, or people can put what they want into liberalism, and they can put more emphasis on certain aspects of it in order to really bring out their own personal philosophy in the overall idea of liberalism. And that's why I called it the empty void of liberalism. But maybe I'll get a little bit of pushback. Probably not. Those are always just fun to put out my ideas. They're less scripted, and I do those really for my own enjoyment, and also just to put something out on Twitter and have some exposure there. So with all that said, thank you for joining me for this episode of the Daily Flip podcast. All of that is out of the way, so there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe. Don't die.